Welcome back to another episode of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler. On today's episode, I interview my good buddy for a second time on the show, Gary Quesenberry. Gary's a retired Federal Air Marshal and the author of the Heads Up series, featuring his latest book, Spotting Danger Before It Spots Your Teens. Now sit back and relax and enjoy this episode of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. What is up, podcast land? Welcome to another episode of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler. Before I introduce this familiar face, if you're a fan of the podcast, you're going to remember Gary. But if you haven't seen the previous episodes, Gary Quesenberry is an American hero, an author, a TV star, you name it, and a good buddy of mine. But before we talk to Gary, I want to first tell everybody where they can hear the podcast. Pretty much anywhere audio podcasts are heard. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, you name it. All I ask is that you hit the automatic download and subscribe buttons, so that way you get to listen to them whenever you feel like it, and they're always in your queue, and you're ready to rock and roll whenever you got time to listen to a Two Dates and a Dash podcast. If you want to learn more about me, Matt Cubbler, you can go to mattcubbler.com. You can also learn more about the book I wrote called A Brother's Love, a Memoir, which is the book I wrote about my brother Andy back in 2006. Seems like yesterday. But my brother was autistic and had a severe stutter and sadly died in a car accident in 1989. And the book is just my life with my brother and my brother through my eyes. And it's the truest, realest, most amazing thing I've ever done in my life. And I'd appreciate it if you took the time to read it. What else? Oh, YouTube. If you go to Matt Cubbler, that's my YouTube channel. Please subscribe and hit the little bell thingy jingy so you can get notified whenever I have a new video coming up like this one. All right, I think that about covers the Matt Cubbler ankle. Gary, what's up, buddy?
Hey, how's it going, man? It's good to be back.
Hey, man, it's always good to have repeats. There's probably three or four repeats, and you're in good company. You're in good. You got Kurt Schilling as a repeater, and Gary, right. Gary Quesenberry. I mean, there's quite a list of who's who in the zoo. Double attendees to the Two Days in the Dash podcast.
I'm honored.
So what's up with you? What's been going on?
Well, nothing, man. Still enjoying the retired life and putting all of my efforts pretty much into this book series and starting to do a little more in those lines, like the public speaking and stuff like that. I was invited down to the Florida chapter of the Well-Armed Woman to be their keynote speaker when they kick things off in February. And it looks like I may be going to Grand Junction, Colorado at the end of April for another speaking event. And I'm actually going to be able to do a little bit of shooting on the range out there as an instructor. And that's for a girl and a gun. And, they got a good thing going on. They're looking for competent instructors to get out there and teach a little bit. So I get to do that for a few days. So it's all great, man. But heart and soul of it is the book, and I'm really enjoying the writing process.
I'm jealous because I got 16 more months before I retire and enjoy the fruits of my labor like you are, and really just get to open up and see what's out there for me once I have a clean plate without any people putting pressure upon me to be someone in their world.
One thing you're going to find is that you put a lot more pressure on yourself in retirement than anybody put on you when you were working. So
wow,
just be ready for that. I know you're that kind of guy. You like to get out there and do things and push yourself. And you have a lot more time to do that. You'll find that you push yourself harder.
For everybody, just give a background. So Gary and I knew each other through our previous employment, working for the Department of Homeland Security. And one of the cool things about Gary is through that employment and through his career, he was able to become one hell of a fucking shot with firearms. Like, he can shoot his ass off. And I consider myself phenomenal, but I'm like JV compared to Gary. And he was on the TV show. For those of you that are History Channel nuts, and I know I am, there was a show back in the day that was on called Top Shot. And Gary was one of the early episodes, and a couple other guys that we worked with were on that TV show too. One guy from my field office specifically was on it. Two guys from my field office were on it. And actually one of my classmates from Federal Air Marshal Basic, Chris Serino, was on it too. So it's really weird how so many people within our agency were all on that show, but it just proves the level of training and expertise that they required to select the people that got hired early on in that program. But but Top Shot was a great show. And then you were on Top Shot All Stars.
Yes.
And like, so that's like, for people that don't understand, it's tough to shoot just to shoot. It's tough to shoot for qualifications in law enforcement. It's tough to shoot to become proficient. It's really tough to shoot when the TV cameras are watching you. And you know that if you shit the bed, the entire nation is going to know that you just shit the bed.
Yeah.
How hard was that? How hard was that process of being that much under a microscope with such a very, the smallest change in technique and focus can change the outcome?
Well, it was a very eye-opening experience, to say the least, because, you think things are going to go a certain way, but inevitably there's so many factors when people start filming that, and it's a Hollywood type production. There's so many things that go into it. There are people everywhere. Like, you just see the contestants and the host and the competition. You don't see the hundreds of people behind you that's running everything from the food service to the sound guys to the camera guys. And it was hard to get used to, because, you and I, whenever we'd go out to the range, they'd give you your safety briefing, they give you your round count on the mags, you start prepping mags, and then you're off to the races. You're shooting all day long. But with that, you'd get out there, you'd practice, you get maybe 3 or 4 rounds of practice so they get some good footage. Anytime a plane would fly over, you'd get the call to hold for sound. So you get yourself all amped up for the competition. And then right before you're ready to start, you'd have to stop because there's a plane going over, things you don't think about. And then you get, how that adrenaline starts building up, and then it just goes away. And then you got to ramp yourself back up again. And it was just always, it was competition, but it was Hollywood style competition. So it was a lot of fun, but you learned a lot of lessons doing it.
I can only imagine it's no different than any other reality TV show, I'm sure. Right. So it's in this construct of it, right? There's the editing, there's the everything you see on the TV screen isn't actually 100% actually how it all went down. There was, maybe they filled in some B-roll to make it look like it was part of the competition. Like, there's a lot of things I'm sure that go on in that. And when you got a chance, because you went back and did it a second time, so it couldn't have been too horrible of an experience. So
that was good.
When you saw the first iteration of your first episode, when you were on the first season that you were on Top Shot, what was your first initial thought of watching yourself and the castmates in the show?
Well, I'd seen enough of. I was on season 3, was my first season on Top Shot. So I'd seen season 1 and I had seen season 2. And anybody that's watched the show, or any other reality show for that matter, that they're characters. And you kind of are who you are, but just through the fact that they're filming you 24 hours a day, they could take footage and make you look one way or another. So it was very important to me to just stay professional and polite and shoot my best, because at the end of the day, that's what the show was all about. People like to see camaraderie. People like the drama, you know what I mean? And there were people there for that. That's not what I was there for. So I wanted to make sure that the way I acted and treated other people reflected well on my family and my community. And then at the end of the day, I wasn't allowed to say that I was a Federal Air Marshal. But at the end of the day, I knew that those guys were going to be, my peers were going to be watching this and judging me based on my performance. So it was important to me to know, and it's hard because you get so frustrated sometimes, but to keep that, that professional face on and try to just represent everybody well and make everybody proud at the end of the day. I ended up on season 3, finishing 3rd. And, they wanted some of the people that performed well to come back for the All-Star season. And I was lucky enough to get invited back for the All-Star season. So it all worked out. And I think at the end of the day, there were a couple of things that I went through on the show and maybe didn't make the cameras, or, certain ways things looked on camera that I wish I could have changed. But at the end of the day, I think overall it was a really good experience. And I think that I performed well enough to not come back and have all my peers talking smack on me. So that was the one thing that kept me motivated and focused, because I knew how hard it would be if I went out there and came back on the first day, like I didn't make it. You know what it's like, how give you a hard time. So I wanted to avoid that at all costs.
I think one of the cool things was that having worked with everybody that was on that show, Mike Seeklander, Sereno, Jarrett, you, like the guys that I knew, A, personally, and B, their quality of shooting skills and professionalism as federal officers. I just thought you all handled yourself really well. And there was a difference between the Navy SEALs and the Special Forces guys, and you could see there was a common theme amongst the guys that worked for our agency on how they conducted themselves on the show. And I'll commend you for having the wherewithal to understand that there is a component to professionalism that is important, because that's not real life, that show, right? So you have to go back to real life and realizing that you don't control the outcome of the editing,
right?
And there's going to be a variable of that. And had you said, well, that's not me, they took moments of time and edited to make me look like this or that, then that's kind of on you, right? Because you have control over that.
Yeah. It was, and they can only air what you give them, so it's important to put that in the back of your mind. And there was one instance on the All-Star season where something happened that I just completely lost my cool on set. Like I snapped, and I snapped on a lot of people, and they were filming the whole thing. And I've never really told this story in public, but I'll tell you now. I think it's been kind of long enough. But we had just finished the sniper challenge on the All-Star season, and we get back to the house, and they weren't doing a lot of filming in the house during the All-Star season. They wanted to be primarily about the competition. But we noticed when we got back to the house that there were just cameras everywhere. They were in the house, they were outside the house, they were filming. So we're like, something's going on, what's happening? So one of the assistants, the PAs, came over and was like, hey, Gary, we got to talk to you over here for a second. And when he pulled me aside, there were cameras following us. And it's very unusual for them to film a PA. So I'm like, all right, something's wrong. Well, the PA, God bless him, he's a great guy, and he's just relaying information to me. But he told me that my father had passed away. So they're filming this, and I'm having a really difficult time. And people had their hand on my shoulder, and they were trying to console me. And then the PA said something weird. He said something about how my cousin had called, and my dad had passed away in the garden, and my cousin, and he said the name. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not my cousin. I don't know what you're like. And then I start piecing stuff together in my head. Long story short, my dad's alive and kicking. He's fine to this day, right? And what had happened was one of my best friend's father had passed away, and his sister had called because I was really good friends with the family. They felt like it was important for me to know, right? Well, what I didn't understand was they had called early that morning, like early that morning before we ever started filming. But they wanted to get the filming out of the way before they broke the news to me. So at some point during that 8 hours, roughly 8 hours, the story was, hey, one of your best friend's father had died. His sister had called to let you know, and that they wanted you to be at the services and stuff like that. So the story, how it is, that little whisper story where you tell something and by the time it gets to you, it's completely different. Well, by the time it went through the assistants, the person that answered the phone, the assistants, the producers, everybody involved, when it got to me, it was my father. So I was livid. I was so angry. I threatened to throw the cameraman in the swimming pool in the backyard, just all this stuff, and they're trying to calm me down. And what made me so mad was not the way they broke the news to me. It was the fact that they felt it was more important for them to get that footage in the can before they told me, so that they could have that episode finished. And to me, that was cruel. It was inhumane. And that showed me what Hollywood was really about. So I lost my mind. I was ready to leave. And they ended up, the producer came in and apologized, and we talked things out. He let me yell and get it out of my system. And then we went back to film. But those are the type of things that happen behind the scenes that people just aren't aware of. And it can get, very intense very quickly. And because you're away from your family, they don't necessarily let you have phone calls and stuff every day. It starts to build up. And if something like that happens where that bubble gets burst, there's a lot of anger that can come out, and they're catching all that on film. So luckily none of that, made it. I felt like I was justified in it. But based on what I said and did when they were filming that, they could have really made me look like a complete asshole. And I'm glad that the producer had enough,
brains
sympathy for the situation to realize, okay, look, we made a mistake, and if we put this on TV, it's going to look really bad on us. So they just cut the whole thing out. But
That's probably smart.
it was it was that's a little behind the scenes story that it's the first time I've ever told it, actually, in public, but it was stressful.
Well, you and Kurt Schilling again told a story for the first time that no one's ever heard. So Kurt, everybody knows Kurt Schilling had the bloody sock game in the World Series with the Red Sox, and but the true story behind the bloody sock he never told publicly until my show. So that was like what actually happened leading up to those games where he pitched with the bloody sock, and there was a big spiritual faith-based component to that he never shared with the world. And I was pretty honored that he shared it on my show. And thank you for sharing that. That's not, I'm sure that was a very difficult period to go through, because God forbid, having to get that and what if it was your dad, right? And they waited, and to magnify that problem even worse, what if it really was your father and they had waited all day to tell you that your father had passed, and that's what they had thought it was. So their intention was they were withholding that information, even though there was whisper down the lane it changed. The PA was delivering a message that your father had died, and they apparently knew this all day long. So I think there's the world is kind of fucked up at times, and we're human, and humans make mistakes, and we're all fallible, and we're all guilty of poor judgment. And but that's where the Christianity component comes in, and that forgiveness part, and understanding that. And I think that's one of the, if I learned anything over the last 2 years of whatever this is we're living through, is that you have to revert back to your faith and the things that keep you true to who you are and what your moral compass is and what you believe in and what your integrity and all that stands for. And I think that's, you've always displayed that level of knowledge of who you are. And I think that's one of the cool things about you. And quite frankly, I didn't work with a lot of guys that didn't have that, because I think they chose wisely. Of all the things the government could have screwed up on, the Federal Air Marshal program was probably the one they could have really screwed up on, because it was thrown together so fast after 9/11 that they could have chosen poorly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And they didn't. And I think and I don't know if that was just shit luck or by design, but the quality of people they brought on in that first wave when we got hired was tremendous.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And as with any job, there's going to be people that slip through the cracks, that maybe didn't, but they weeded themselves out fairly quickly, and I think there in the beginning, for one, most of the field offices had people that were air marshals prior to 9/11, stand those field offices up, develop their training programs, guys like Craig Sawyer, Sawman, and people like that, guys with just these tremendous backgrounds that understood what it took to succeed in that line of work. And they were the guys that stood the field offices up. And those were the guys that created the original training curriculum and worked hand in hand with those contract instructors that got us up to a certain point before they turned us loose in the field offices. So, I look back on all the training I've had over the years, and, I was very fortunate to come into this job when I did, right after 9/11 with that core group of guys. And to me, I still got friends that work in Atlantic City, and the people that are coming through now, they're, they were infants on 9/11, most of them. And they don't have the connection, to it. I'll say most of them don't have the connection to it that we did, because we saw it happen. We had to explain it to our children, and most of us had served in some capacity before, and we were angered by it, so we went in with that attitude, like, we're going to fix this. We're going to keep this from happening. And I think as time has gone on, that attitude has changed. People have different motivations now for coming into the job as they did when we came in, but the mission is still the same. That part hasn't changed. And, luckily we've got still some people there who understand what that mission is and how to get people to, trained up to the point where they can prevent something like that from happening again. So
I remember one of the most eye-opening things for me, and I came from SWAT and law enforcement. I was a cop for 9 years before 9/11 happened. And I was pretty proficient in every weapon system that I ever had to use, but I never had to shoot for my pay before. And,
Right.
we were shooting to get paid. Like if you wanted to raise, you had to achieve goals, and
Yeah.
how you shot under pressure was how you achieved that goal. And that, that to me was one of the greatest differentiators
Yeah.
that they could have created. Now was it always fair because of weather situations and what have you? No, but at the end of the day, how you shot was how you got paid. And that
Yeah,
was
exactly.
and our job was to potentially be very, very good at shooting at 37,000 feet in a tube.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. With no
Keep the
backup.
plane in the air. Right. And no backup. Right.
Yeah.
Other than maybe a missile.
It's funny because, people think about that. And now when I came in, that had just ended, the whole shooting for your job thing. We were still doing the TPC before it swapped over to the PPC. But, you heard those horror stories, like the class right before you go out to the range, there's two vans and you shoot the TPC. If you pass it, you get in this van. If you don't pass it, you get in that van. That van takes you to the airport and you're done. And the thing, you talk about stress, like you just quit your old job. And there's a lot of guys that quit jobs that they had 7-10 years into, and there's no safety net. There's no guarantee that you go back to that job. So, you're just out there kind of putting your best foot forward and hoping that everything works out. And the only thing that you could blame it on if you failed was your own lack of skill. And it was a stressful thing, but stressful thing for a lot of people. A lot of people got weeded out, but in the end, I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing. And when you look at what's going on today, with the public and law enforcement and some groups, wanting to defund police and things like that. I've always been a big supporter of the fact that law enforcement's hard. It's a tough job. You got to make hard decisions in the heat of a moment that most people can't even fathom what that's like. And, instead of defunding the police, why don't you pump some more money into it? Because the first thing that gets cut when you're looking at, a budget for a police office, the first thing that gets cut is training. You know that. I know that. It happened in the Federal Air Marshal Service. But, without that training piece, it's a critical component, because unless you're out there working the streets and saving lives, you should be training to do just that. And I think a lot of bureaucrats lose sight of that, and they look at that bottom line, which I understand. I run a business. You got to think about the bottom line. But at the same time, you also have to think about what that end goal is, what your overall mission is, and how do you accomplish that? You don't accomplish it by taking away the most important components that makes that person capable, in a violent situation.
I mean, what a great example of that. And I can't say it's 100% factual all the way, but I've heard enough contextual stories about what happened with the incident up in Minneapolis with the woman who pulled her handgun out instead of the taser and shot the guy on the car stop. She wasn't on the street for a very long time prior to that. She had been in other divisions doing non-patrol duties, whether it's public affairs, whatever the need was. She wasn't working the street a lot.
Right.
And that it just proves how perishable your training skills can be if you're not training them.
Right.
If you only shoot your weapon once a year and you get thrown into a shit show where you've got to perform magnificently without error in the heat of a moment, you better hope to God was on your side, because you didn't put enough time and energy into making sure that you control that outcome.
Right.
That muscle memory component, that visualization component, that repetition of training scenarios is what keeps a cop from getting sued and making the ultimate mistake, which is taking somebody's life.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I've taken seriously my whole career, because I certainly don't want to be that guy.
Right.
That does that. And I don't want to be, I don't want my family to have to go through what the ancillary trauma that comes from that to them, as being the wife, son, or daughter of, or the parent of an officer who took somebody's life and it turns out he made a mistake.
Right.
And that's a real thing that we in law enforcement deal with every single day, is that fear of being that person. And when you don't have the opportunity to train at the level in which you need to train to avoid that as much as possible. Nothing is 100%, but if you aren't giving it all the time and energy and effort to do that, and not everybody has the ability to on their own to afford ammo, to afford range time, to afford jujitsu or Krav Maga or other different types of stuff on their own. So they rely on the department to provide that opportunity for them. If the department doesn't do that, it puts them at a deficit that is compounded every single day until, God forbid, that event actually happens.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's
tough.
Yeah, it's very tough. And, you know, that also translates to the civilian world. You know, you got a lot of people, you know, these conferences and stuff that I'm doing where I'm talking about the books and situational awareness and stuff like that. You know, I talk about it from the perspective of someone who carries a gun, not just as part of my career, but I still carry a gun every day. And I understand, because I've witnessed it, how perishable those skills can be. That's the reason, you know, on my little farm here, I've got a range on the back part of the property where I can still go and train and keep myself sharp. So, you know, it's a responsibility. If you take a job in law enforcement, you have a responsibility to the citizens that you're being paid to protect. If you're a citizen carrying arms, you have a responsibility to keep yourself sharp so that you don't do something stupid and ruin someone else's life, you know, trying to protect your own, you know, someone innocent. And, you know, there's a lot of factors that come into play. And I don't think people that just, you know, they go out, they take a 2-hour online CCW course, they take a written test, and they're like, okay, I'm putting my gun on, I'm good, I'm protected, you know, freedom, all that good stuff. And, you know, without realizing, you know, the consequences that come with poor performance, you know, in that field. If you were to draw that gun and hurt someone innocent, make a bad decision in the heat of the moment, there's so many different things than just punching holes in paper that go into properly training someone to carry a firearm, whether it be professionally or personally. And that's one of the gaps that I hope to close in retirement, is to try to raise some of that awareness and do some teaching and instruction for people that may not necessarily, they got that CCW permit, but they don't understand those next steps that they need to make themselves as proficient as they can be.
I'm going to put you on the spot right now. I have, we talked before the show that I bought my 30 acres in Missouri. And one of the things I'm doing, my retirement business is going to be doing small group firearms training. And I'm putting a range on the back of my range, 50-yard range. So I'm going to ask you right now to commit to coming out and doing a training program out there.
I'm committed. Yeah. Count me in, man.
Everybody, hold them accountable. Hold me accountable. So that's a great transition. So for those of you that, you know, we've talked about all the stuff that Gary has done in law enforcement and TV, but one of the things he's most proud of now, and something that, you know, once you retire, we talked about this a little bit off air too, you know, you're able to do things that you've never thought you were able to do. You know, you never thought you were going to be an author, yet here you are with a publishing deal and a 4-part series book deal called the Heads Up series that talks about situational awareness.
Yeah.
And, you know, you've already written 2 books. The first one was Spotting Danger Before It Spots You. Then it was Spotting Danger Before It Spots Your Kids.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Now this next one that's just about to come out is Spotting Danger Before It Spots Your Teens.
Yes.
What is, first of all, let's take a 35,000-foot view of this as being Air Marshal. That's where we spent most of our time. What was the concept behind the Heads Up series?
Well, it actually started when I was still working as a Federal Air Marshal, and I was doing a little bit of teaching on the side for different groups. Like you said, small group instruction for private citizens. One of the groups that I taught for was a group of instructors. They're already firearms instructors in Kentucky, but they wanted, you know, to learn about correcting shooter deficiencies, identifying and correcting shooter deficiencies, things you don't necessarily talk about in a standard just firearms course. So one of the things I always talked about when I was on the range teaching whoever was situational awareness. I think that's an incredibly important component in your overall personal safety. Because I've always said you can't fight what you don't see coming. You can't effectively fight what you don't see coming. You know, you get caught off guard, you're fighting from behind the 8 ball. That's never a good thing. So the further out you can see something happening and you can kind of anticipate what your options may be in that situation, the faster you can react to squash it. So anyway, they wanted me to put on a course that was specifically about situational awareness. So I start writing everything out on one of my notepads. And the more I looked at it, the more I started thinking, I'm like, wow, this looks like a table of contents. You could totally turn this into a book. And that's what I did. I got on my computer, I pulled up a Word document, and I transposed all those, bullet points that I had for my curriculum on there. And I treated it like a table of contents, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And then every time I'd get on a flight, I'd make notes. I never liked having computers and stuff out in front of me whenever I was flying in case you had to react to something, but I would keep my little notepad out. So, I'd make notes about different bullets and different points that I wanted to make. And then when I'd get back to the hotel, I'd fire everything up and I'd start filling in those bullet points. After about 6 months, I had about a 70-some thousand word manuscript. And I started shopping that around to different publishing companies because I didn't want to self-publish. I wanted that sense of accomplishment that someone besides myself bought into this and felt like it was worthy of putting out in the world. So I got a letter. I got several rejection letters, and I got a letter back from YMAA Publications, who ended up publishing the book and signing me to a 4-book contract. And their thing was like, this is super broad, because in my writing, I had started covering things that went beyond situational awareness. And I talked about every aspect of personal defense. Everything that we learned in the Federal Air Marshal service, I was pretty much putting on paper, short of giving up any, government secrets or whatever. Mm-hmm. So they told me, they said, listen, it was a rejection letter. They were still rejecting my manuscript, but they were like, here's what we want you to do. We want you to just focus on the situational awareness piece. Take all the other stuff out, just situational awareness, resubmit. So I kind of salvaged what I could out of that original manuscript and made it just about situational awareness. And I wrote it from the perspective of a private citizen, not necessarily a Federal Air Marshal or a cop or a soldier, because I wanted people to be able to read it and understand it and immediately be able to apply those principles to their personal life. So second manuscript, I sent it off to YMAA. They loved it. They saw a lot of potential in like a series, and they signed me to a 4-book contract. And, now here I am. It's been a wild ride, and I'm super grateful for it. And I found out that I really enjoy just the creative process of writing and research and all the different things that go into it.
It allows you to be, I think you and I and many of our colleagues are the same. We have a lot of shit in our heads.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's just bouncing around in there nonstop. It's never ending. And, shutting down is hard.
Oh, absolutely.
And I found writing a book about some shit that was bouncing around in my head allowed me to shut that part, at least, down every day, because I was able to put it in, give it a life, do something with it. Did you find that because you clearly had a burning desire to get this stuff out?
Yeah.
Did you find, because it was very similar, I wrote my book while I was an air marshal in hotels, little microphone with a little tape recorder that I would sit in my seat and I would just say stuff into and then stop. And then I would write it all down later on that night. Did you find it cathartic to get this out? That part of you out?
I did because, I worked in Atlantic City for 3 years and as a firearms instructor, and I was a lead firearms instructor for a while. So you get really good at curriculum development and understanding what a terminal performance objective is and the enabling performance objectives that get a person to that end goal that you want them to reach. And you keep all that stuff in mind. And when you're just sitting there with this time on your hands, you have to stay alert and aware of your surroundings. So that was always in the back of my mind. And it was very, like you said, it was cathartic to me because, like you said, at the end of the day, I could close that piece. Now I know that I've got these stories and these examples of how situational awareness helps out into the world. And I'm doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily, I'm not a fear monger. I'm not trying to tell you that there's a killer around every corner that you have to be looking out for. I'm just giving you practical examples of how situational awareness can help you, feel safer and give you a more productive life, just in the fact that you're not worried about the dangers that lurk around every corner. So if I could, I grew up, when I was a kid in a little bit of a rough household when my mom remarried my stepfather. And, so you grow up afraid and you hate that feeling, especially when you're little. And as you get older, you realize, okay, I'm in control of this. I can be as timid and afraid as I want to be, or I can be as strong and outgoing as I want to be. And, you make those decisions, and hopefully the information that you put in these books, whether it's my book or your book, helps somebody make that decision on how they want to live their life. And to me, that was the cathartic piece, is knowing that what you're putting out in the world could possibly help somebody, somebody that maybe a child that was in the same situation you were in when you were younger, or, a mother who's worried about how their children are being raised, or how, they're being bullied at school. There's information in these books that can kind of give you the tools you need to counteract those negative feelings and have a more proactive approach to your personal safety.
It's hard to, I mean, as a parent, it's not hard, but it's hard to put it, it's the hardest to do what you do as a parent, especially a law enforcement father, teaching your kids the things that are in your brain without making them completely paranoid and worried about the world collapsing around them. How did you, because the second book was geared for 4 to 11 or 12-year-olds, right?
Yeah, 4 to 12 years old.
And then this next one is for clearly teenagers. How did you wrap your head? Because I think it would be more difficult than writing the first one, which was more of a generic, broader scope, generalized understanding of how to be aware of your surroundings and keep yourself safe. How did you get yourself dialed in to the psychological profiles of the pretty wide range 4 to 12-year-old mindset?
Yeah. Well, it really, to be honest, it wasn't that hard, because I've raised, my wife and I have raised 3 children, and they're all grown now. They're all out of the house. So we've dealt with these, these incremental steps in our children's development, and how certain things they do affect their personal safety. So I can't remember if I told the story the first time I was on your podcast. It's in my first book, and I touch on it briefly in other books. But there was an incident when I lived in Las Vegas, when I first started with the Federal Air Marshal service. And you'll remember back in the day, there were guys who were kind of getting targeted. They would get these suspicious packages, and it was back during the big anthrax scare and ricin and all this different stuff. And, I was on a trip to Baltimore. I was on an overnight trip to Baltimore from Las Vegas. My wife called me. And again, I apologize if I told this story earlier.
I don't think you did.
But she called and she's like, what the hell's going on? Like the school I'm at the school. They said that you called, you're taking the kids out, they're moving away, and you're supposed to be here to pick them up at, 3, which was like 30 minutes earlier than their release time. And I didn't know what she was talking about. I'm like, I didn't do any of that. Like, what are you talking about? So what had happened was, I had 2 children in school. One child was still at home. She wasn't school age yet. So the 2 kids that were in school were in, I think, the 1st and 3rd grade, maybe. And someone had called the elementary school in North Las Vegas and identified themselves as Gary Quesenberry. They said that I worked for the Federal Air Marshal Service, and they had my children's name, what classes they were in. And they said that because of their job, they were getting transferred to another field office. They would have to pull the kids out early. So to pack up all their stuff, have them standing by, they would be there at 3 o'clock to pick them up. I don't know who this person was, and I don't know why they did it. But obviously my family was targeted by someone for some reason. Now, luckily, my wife always volunteered at the school. She would go in because they were shorthanded and make copies for teachers, or just however she could help out. Well, she'd been out running some errands. She finished up early. She took my youngest daughter to the school with her, and they were going to see if the teachers needed any help. And that's when they told her about what had happened. Well, like we were talking about earlier, we had some pretty high-speed people working for us in the beginning. And I called those guys, and I was like, hey, listen, I'm in Baltimore. This is just what happened, and I need some help. So they were able to get in touch with my wife, walk her through everything that needed to happen. They got me on the next flight back, a red eye from Baltimore back to Las Vegas. And luckily, no one ever showed up that day. So it may have been because of the increased police presence that we had at the school almost instantly. They knew something was going down, and it never happened. Now, I like to think that my children were smart enough to know if some guy shows up at the school saying they're their dad, they're like, that's not my dad.
Right.
We'd raised them that way. But I tell this story because, my children were in that age range, that 12 to 14 age range, where they saw what was happening, even though they didn't necessarily understand what or why it was happening, but they understood that something was very wrong. And they saw the police, and they listened to them interview us in the house, and we kept them out of school for a few days. And, it was, it changed their life as much as it changed our life. So when we started talking to our children about situational awareness, we had a little more buy-in than, a parent who hasn't had to deal with something like that. So, at the end of the day, I wrote the books with that particular incident in mind. And anyone who's raised a child has a story about something that scared them in terms of their child's safety. You were separated from them in a crowded grocery store or at an event. You lost contact with your child. So that second book is there to teach parents how to teach their children about what happens in those situations and how they should react so that you can both work towards the same goal, which is reuniting, and your child's safety at the end of the day. And then it just took that a step further in this third book that comes out April the 1st, Spotting Danger Before It Spots Your Teens. Now you're dealing with an entirely different dynamic. Now you've got, say, a 15, 16-year-old, they're getting their driver's license. They're trying to figure out who they are, what their place is in the world, and they're seeking that to break away from that parental control and develop their own sense of independence. And with that comes its own challenges. So that's what that third book is about, like how to let them explore their individuality, find their independence, but do so in a way that keeps them safe through situational awareness.
I think it's, first of all, brilliant because it's every parent wants it, right? It's like,
right.
Not every parent has our background, but every parent has the same fears and concerns over their child's safety,
Sure.
right? So nothing
Hopefully.
changes about, hopefully, it's a perfect world, but it's the, and I knowing you, I know that it's done in a way that is thoughtful, intuitive, and most importantly, realistic and useful. And because there's a guy, and I'm sure you've seen the videos on TikTok or Instagram with the guy with the weapons defense that's like almost like a parody where everything he does is like this, like a firearm takeaway. And it's just,
there's a couple of those guys and I love them. I love watching.
He's one guy, he looks Hispanic or maybe light skinned black guy, but really stocky. And he's got all the vests and everything
patches.
on. Yeah.
I know who you're talking about.
And it's got to be a parody because it's just so, I would assume everybody looks and goes, it's so bad that it can't be real. But what if it was? What if you're the parent who just doesn't know the difference and thinks that that's self-defense from a firearms and that's what you train and you think that that's what's going to save your life. And then shit hits the fan and you're up at Jesus. Like, we don't need that. We need more realistic blueprints that parents can follow that are simple and understandable and easily conveyed to their children so that as a family unit, you can walk into a mall or a restaurant or out in the middle of New York City in Times Square and feel safe knowing that each of you know where your responsibilities are and what the potential outcomes could be of any situation. And I'll give you an example of mine. So I take everything a little bit extreme because I'm a little bit much, as people say. But third grade, my daughter asked me to chaperone her class, be a chaperone for her class to Philly down to Center City for like the whole Liberty Bell, Independence Hall. I'm like, yeah. So I get my 6 kids and I call them in and I'm in front of all the parents. I said, we are now C Squad. You hear C Squad? Your eyes are on me. I said, you will never not be within eyesight of me. When I call C Squad, you will eyes on me. When I put my arms up and I do this, it's rally on me. It means come around me. We do not change or deviate from this. And I'm giving them all these instructions on what to do. Your buddy system, never be more than 6 feet away from your buddy. Like, I'm giving them all these different tools to use to at least be safe with each other, but to always be looking for me. Like I'm the moon, right? And they're trying, right? I need them to be looking for me. And my daughter's third grade teacher comes, she goes, I think you're a little extreme. I said, I am not losing a kid on my watch. I said, I don't care how extreme you think I am. My kids, the 6 that I'm responsible for, their parents will thank me when today's over. And still to this day, those kids always go, they see me, they're like, C Squad. They're adults. They're 24 years old. So it's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a funny story, back in the day when we first got ramped up with the Federal Air Marshal service. It was a couple of years in the Las Vegas field office. They decided it would be a good idea to have, to participate in the Bring Your Kid to Work Day. Well, at the time I was working a 6-month stint as an instructor in the field office. And the day that was going to be Bring Your Children to Work Day was edge weapons defense and tactics, in the simulator. So I bring my kids to the office, and they got to hang out in the little training office and stuff. We got to walk them through all the different things. So, we started with a PT warm up. I had my kids in there working out with the FAMs in the office. There were several kids there. We all had a blast. And then when it came to the edged weapons defense, we had those the old training knives that had the felt around the edge that you put like a lipstick on, and you put white t-shirts on and mark each other up, with the edged weapons defense. So we let the kids do that, and they thought it was a blast. And then we took them into the simulator, and we taught them about positions of dominance, and we taught them about, different tactics and techniques. And we let them run through a little easy scenario where they got to take down a bad guy, and they had a blast. Well, it was probably 2 weeks later, and I didn't often go to the school, to pick my kids up because you were, either busy at work or you're offline somewhere or whatever. So I show up at school, and this is Las Vegas. So they line up on these little numbered lines outside because the weather is always great. And, when they see the parent, they would have to high five the teacher, and then the teacher would release the student over to the parent. Well, I see my son high five his teacher, and they come running over, and the teacher's with him, which was unusual. And she goes, can I ask you something? And I'm like, yeah, sure. She goes, what do you do for a living? I'm like, I'm just a government employee. And she's like, oh. And she's like, well, we had the kids talk about what they did during the bring your children to work day. And your son said he got into a knife fight and shot a terrorist. I'm like, well, it was all simulated, but yeah. So, people don't understand, you know what I mean? They don't understand what the kids of law enforcement officers, people who do what we've done, how they live. It's a little bit of a different lifestyle. But at the end of the day, they're just kids. And I say that, to say that the way I wrote these books, I didn't write them from that law enforcement perspective. I wrote them from the perspective of a concerned parent. And I never use fear to instruct a child. I don't want to raise a scared child. I want to teach them that there are bad things in the world that they need to look out for, but teach them how to look out for those things and not just assume that there's danger around every corner. And that becomes especially important when they become teenagers, because they don't always have you right there, rallying around, the hub. Right. They're trying to become their own hub with their own little group. And you've got to teach them what they need so that they can identify threats and take the necessary steps to keep themselves safe. Not just them, but the kids that they hang out with. So, to me, that was an important part of this whole process of writing these books, was to do it in a way that, one, didn't necessarily look at everything through my eyes. I wanted to look at things through the eyes of just the everyday parent who doesn't necessarily have my background. And then I wanted to do it in a way where the children didn't feel afraid of everything they encountered. And it actually gave them a sense of confidence and pride in the fact that they can go out and do these things and keep themselves safe and take some level of responsibility for their own well-being.
Basically, you wrote a book the way that you raise your children. And my daughter, funny, just another Air Marshal story because they're just funny. So we were flying on vacation down to Tampa and out of Philly, and we get on the plane. We're on a 767, so it's 242 the seat alignment, and my wife and daughter were in the 2 on the left. And I'm putting up the luggage for the family, and my son. My son was 9 months old or something. So my daughter's about 5 probably. And I'm putting the luggage up, and I hear this, Daddy. I said, what's up, baby? She's like, did you remember your gun? I said, yeah, baby, I did. I'm good. Thank you. She's like, good. We're safe then. And then she sat back down. But it was like the record scratch, everybody stopped and just sort of looked at me and her. And I'm like, have a good flight. And I'm finished putting the luggage up. It was just, but for her, at 5 years old, she understood that this was my job and that this was how I kept people safe. And this was, so her acknowledgement at such a young age of what that meant just goes to show how perceptive kids are.
Sure. How old was she?
5.
So a funny story, and I put it in my book, my second book, Spotting Danger Before It Spots Your Kids. And I talk about that, how kids are very perceptive, and they know, you might not think they're watching you, but they are always watching you. They're always learning from what you do. And when we lived in Las Vegas, I got pulled over a couple times with the kids in the car, just, speeding, nothing crazy, just speeding. And there's a particular interaction that you go through when you're armed and you're in your car and you get pulled over. And I'm sure you understand this. You want to make sure you go through all the proper steps. If it's dark, the interior lights on, windows down, the car's off, hands are on the steering wheel where they can see your fingers and things like that. So, I would go through those routines every time. And inevitably, when the cop would walk up to the window, they would ask the question, is there anything in the car that could possibly hurt me? Any, weapons, needles, things like that. So I would always say, yes, sir. I have my duty weapon on me. It's in the, I'm carrying appendix. My creds are right here in the console if you'd like for me to get them. And they'd be like, who do you work for? Federal Air Marshal Service. Show them the creds. I'd be like, all right, slow it down. And you drive off. That's usually how that interaction went. Not always, but sometimes that's how it went. And my children, when they were in the car with me, they saw that interaction maybe once, maybe twice. And they knew what that was. So one night we're driving back from Idaho. My wife's family, a lot of her brother and some of his family lives in Idaho. So we went up there for Thanksgiving. We're driving back in the middle of the night through the desert, headed back to Las Vegas. And I'm going pretty fast. I'm doing I'm right at 100 miles an hour going through the desert. It's the middle of the night. Nobody's out there. You can see for miles in any direction. And I don't know where this dude came from, but all of a sudden the blue lights hit me. So my youngest daughter, she's still so small that she's in a car seat in the back. The other two kids are knocked out of sleep. My wife's asleep. I'm like, honey, got to wake up. I'm getting pulled over. I need you to dig out the registration. I go through my little routine, hands on the steering wheel. And I'm thinking all the kids are asleep in the back. So I got my window down. Police officer comes up to the side of the car. And first thing out of his mouth was, do you know how fast you were going? And from the back, there's sweet little Emily in the back, starts screaming, he's got a gun. He's got a gun. So because she knew that in the past that's gotten me out of a speeding ticket, and she's just trying to be helpful. Well, the cop goes full Barney Fife, he's like this, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm a police officer, I'm law enforcement, I have my service weapon on me. So once everything de-escalated and calmed down, we both had a really good laugh over it, and before he turned me loose, he looked back in the back seat and he was like, honey, he goes, the next time your daddy gets pulled over, you need to let him tell the officer about the gun. Okay. So it's just a funny experience, but there's some valuable lessons in that yes, they are always watching, whether you know it or not. And they're storing that information away in the back of their mind for future use. And if you don't teach them the right way to implement that, it could be a hazard. So you got to be careful.
And you learn about a lot of things when they get older. Like we all have both of us have older children. Yeah. You have these in-depth conversations with your kids and they'll remember things and say, Dad, I remember once when blah, 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 blah. And you're going to be like, wow, I didn't even know you would remember that. Like the things that are in their brain, or an example that you set for them. And I'll give an example. My son, we did a 2-week cross-country trip this past summer, and we're sitting over in Rocky Mountain National Park, each having a glass of Tito's and I don't know, whatever we mixed it with, sitting on a rock overlooking the Rocky Mountains, like 12,000 feet. And he says, Dad, I'm going in the military, or I want to go in the military because I want to have what you and Uncle Toby have, my best friend from the Army. He goes, I want to have those stories, those memories, those relationships, that camaraderie. I watch how you and Uncle Toby are together and the way you act together, and you see each other once or twice a year. And it's like you saw each other yesterday every time you see each other. He goes, I want that. But it's just accumulation of moments, just small moments, because he wasn't there for all of them, but every time that he would see us together, it would ingrain something in his memory and in his soul that he wanted to be like that. And your kids are always paying attention. I think it's just so insightful for you to be sharing your knowledge with the country, with the world, about how to stay safe, because it's the simplest thing we can do as a parent, but it's sometimes the hardest thing, because we don't have, and once they hit a certain age, they're sowing their oats, they're spreading their wings, and we want to keep them safe, but we don't know if we gave them all the tools and all the ammunition required to be safe. And when you have a resource like how to spot danger before it spots you or your kids or your teens or whatever, when you have those different resources available, it's important that parents identify that this is something I can use, and that it's going to be beneficial, and it's going to help fill the gaps on maybe some areas where I'm weak as a parent or don't have the experience.
Right. Yeah. And that, like I said, at the end of the day, that's why I wrote the books, is so that everybody can kind of get that perspective on safety when it comes to the family unit. So, there's a method to the madness. The first book, Spotting Danger Before It Spots You, is just the generalized, like you said earlier, it's just the nuts and bolts of situational awareness, how it works, how you implement it into your daily life. You have to have that as an adult, whether you're single, married, children, no children, doesn't matter. Everyone needs that piece. So the second book, I start thinking about things from my life and my career and from the family perspective. And I felt like it was important to wrap that whole series up from that family perspective. So, the first one is the nuts and bolts pieces of situational awareness. The second one is for parents to teach young children about situational awareness through fun games and interactions that just get them involved with their environment. The third one is for teens, like I said, who are seeking their own independence, but they need to know how to do that in a manner that keeps them safe. And then the fourth one is going to be, it's a family book, so it's going to be situational awareness, spotting danger for travelers. And, you take your family on a vacation, or you go somewhere on a business trip or whatever. And it's how everybody up to this point in the family, whether it's you, your 4-year-old or your 16-year-old, you have a role to play. And as long as you're working in conjunction with each other, and you have that, like you said, that hub, rally around me kind of thing, that's your family unit. And it has to have a centralized figure. And then everybody that revolves around that has the pieces and the tools they need to help ensure the safety of the group overall, if that makes sense.
It does. It's a great concept. I'm sure the third and the fourth book are going to be just as amazingly popular as the other two.
I appreciate it.
I want to make sure that people also know that you're not just an author and a former superhero on a TV show. You're also the founder of Q Series holsters, right? So yeah. you have a company where you make. I'm telling you, people, I don't boast about a lot of cool design. I'm an inventor. I have 4 patents, so I really do appreciate uniqueness. The Q Series holster is badass. It is the thing that, as a cop, one of the hardest things to do is conceal a firearm, especially a full-size firearm, and to do it in a way that is comfortable, that is easily accessible, that doesn't feel like it's digging into your abdomen or your hip or your small of your back. And the Q Series holster is one of the best holsters ever created. I wish you made it for more different variations, like, I don't know, maybe the 92 FS Beretta. I'm just saying, if you want to put one of those together for your friend, that'd be great. But there is just so many great things about that holster that make it so unique and low profile and easily accessible and all the things I just mentioned.
Yeah, that was kind of a fun little thing too to get into. I was, at the time when I came up with it, I was by no means a businessman. I didn't understand how that whole thing worked. And I had made this holster just for myself that I carried. And I was using it on the range that we shot in outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And the guy that ran the range, his girlfriend was there. And she's the entrepreneurial type. And she saw this, and she understands enough about guns and the way people carry to identify the fact that this one was unique. There was something different about this one. So she gets to looking at it. She's like, can I, take some pictures of this, show it to an engineer friend of mine? And like, this would be awesome. Like, I really think people would buy this. So I'm sure, take as many pictures as you want. So she does. They get some measurements and they, everything. And then she contacted me a couple of days later and was like, hey, we could turn this into a business if you're on board. And I was like, all right, let's do it. So we started making these little minimalist inside the waistband concealment holsters that were just developed around the fact that, I've been carrying a gun for, at that point, 14 years every day on these flights. And you're on a 14-hour flight, to Tel Aviv. If your holster is not comfortable, you're just miserable. That's all there is to it. So I always found that the least amount of material you could use that still meets all those specifications that the Federal Air Marshal Service put in place for a holster to be approved, if you could do that, if you could balance those two things, then you had the perfect holster. And that's what I came up with Q Series. I wanted it to have a muzzle downward orientation, completely cover the trigger and the trigger guard, have at least one positive form of retention, and you had to be able to reholster it one-handed. So I took all those things and I built a holster, and then I started trimming it down till it was as minimal as it could be. And then that was what was eventually the Q Series stealth holster. So that's been a wild ride. It's been a lot of fun. And to this day, I've got emails coming in right now. They pop up in the corner from time to time. You got another order. You got another order. So it's mostly been word of mouth. We put a little bit of money into advertising in the beginning, but I was a firm believer in the fact that if this product couldn't perform on its own and get the buy-in from law enforcement and military and people that carry deep concealment most of the time for their career, then it just wasn't worth it. And because it got that buy-in, it really took off.
Well, it's brilliant. Yeah, it seems like everything you touch turns to gold. I may want to put your partner.
No, that's not true. I could write a lot of books about the things that have turned to shit.
Well, listen, where can everybody find the book? What's the website for the book? And then the Q series and everything else you're doing.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, the hub for everything pretty much in terms of the book is GaryQuessenberry.com. So if you go to GaryQuessenberry.com, there's information about all the books and there's links for you to order them. And they're everywhere that books are sold. You can get them at Amazon, you get them at independent booksellers, Barnes & Noble, Target, you name it, it's there. As far as the holsters go, that's QSeriesLLC.com. This past year, we just released a holster for the Springfield Armory Hellcat. That one was pretty popular. And, we got a couple other ideas that we're working on for this year coming up. But that's pretty much it. The books, like I said, you can pick them up everywhere. That's my primary focus now. And that website, GaryQuessenberry.com, is the hub for anything related to the books. Or if you wanted to just email me to talk about maybe setting up some training, a public speaking event, things like that, there's resources on that website for you to do that.
I'll make sure I put both links to Q Series and to your website in the notes for the show. And this one we're going to release as a little bit closer to the launch date for the book. So we're recording this a little bit earlier. We're recording this on the 31st of January, and we'll release it closer to April 1st, just so you have a little bit of promo material for that. And man, I love our time together. I love chatting. I love catching up. I love telling stories and talking some shop and sharing some insight for people that may otherwise not get this insight in their daily lives otherwise.
Yeah, we're going to have to do it in person one of these days, man.
No doubt. Listen,
it's been a long time.
We're going to, once I have you out, you've already committed. You are on record. And as I told our good friend, Kelly Venden, I told a buddy of mine who was Mike Odell, who was he's literally LAPD SWAT, everything that was ever LAPD SWAT he developed. I said, listen, pay sucks, but the company's great. So I'm going to have you out. I'll cover your costs. I'll pay you some money, but it's going to be an amazing time. We'll sit around. We'll shoot some guns. We'll sit by the pond. We'll do some fishing. And
sounds like a perfect time.
All right. All right. Hang tight. We'll talk off the air.
Yeah, man.
Everybody, thank you. Thank you for listening and watching this episode of the 2 Dates in the Dash podcast. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler. Thank you to Gary Quesenberry for being a guest for a second time, one of the few repeat offenders for the podcast. And it's always great to hear his insight and his point of view, and his book series, How to Spot Danger, Spotting Danger Before It Spots You, before it spots your teens, before it spots kids, and then soon coming out in a later date in 2023 for travelers. So he's got a 4-book series. Go to GaryQuessenberry.com. Also for his website for the firearms, QSeriesLLC.com. If you're looking for the greatest holster you're going to find for concealment. And once again, if you want to learn more about me and A Brother's Love and Memoir, the book I wrote about my brother, Andy, go to mattcubbler.com, and don't forget to go to Matt Cubbler on YouTube and subscribe and click that automatic download and the little bell dingy for notifications. All right, everybody, God bless, and go out and be kind to one another.
She was conceived in darkness in a time when men weren't free. The birthing pains brought to life the star that rose to glory. She grew up in pain and strife, unsure of who she'd be, in a time when brave men gave their lives to a history. Sometimes you need to take a stand for more than just a song, to courage, face your fears, and let her freedom right the wrongs. When will we wake and finally see she's worth fighting for? She's waiting by the door for us to open up and rise and be silent no more.